The crack of the rifle shot split the afternoon sky like God himself had struck a match across the heavens, and every man at the Durango Cattle Fair spun around to see what had happened. Cecil Crawford stood with his mouth open, his hat knocked sideways, and his pride shattered into pieces smaller than the clay pigeon that Charlotte Bristol had just obliterated from 400 yards with a single, unhesitating pull of the trigger. He had not seen it coming. That was the truth of it, the raw and humbling truth that he could not swallow fast enough to save himself from the crowd's rising laughter and applause. He had made a bet in front of 200 witnesses, cattlemen, gamblers, ranch wives, trail hands, and visiting merchants from as far east as Denver, that no living person at this fair could outshoot Cecil Crawford. He had made the bet loudly, arrogantly, with both thumbs hooked into his gun belt, and that wide, wolfish grin spread across his jaw like a man who had never once considered the possibility of losing. And then this woman had walked up. She was not what any of them had expected. She wore a practical split riding skirt of dark brown canvas, a sun-faded linen blouse with the sleeves rolled past her elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a band of shadow across eyes the color of winter storm clouds. She carried her rifle like it was a natural extension of her arm, not a weapon she brandished but a tool she lived with. And when she had calmly asked the contest organizer to set the mark at 400 yards instead of the standard 250, half the crowd had laughed. Cecil Crawford had not laughed. He had looked at her, really looked, and he had felt something unfamiliar stir in the back of his chest, not attraction, not yet, but something close to warning. Something that whispered to him that this woman was not playing. But his pride had been too loud and too well-fed for 28 years to let a whisper stop him. So he had taken his shot first. He had hit the clay pigeon cleanly at 250 yards, and the crowd had cheered, because Cecil Crawford always hit what he aimed at. Then Charlotte Bristol had stepped forward, settled the stock of her Winchester Model 1873 against her right shoulder, breathed out slowly through her nose, and touched the trigger with the kind of absolute stillness that only comes from 1,000 hours of solitary practice, and she had sent that clay pigeon into powder at 400 yards without a single visible tremor in her hands. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the crowd erupted. Cecil Crawford stood in the middle of it all, the warm September wind of 1883 blowing dust across the fairgrounds of Durango, Colorado, and he stared at Charlotte Bristol with an expression no one had ever seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment, though both of those things were certainly present. It was something deeper and stranger than either. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that the world is larger than he believed it to be, and that the discovery has left him breathless. She turned and looked at him then, and her expression was composed, almost careful, as if she had expected this reaction and had prepared herself for whatever roughness would come next. He had a reputation, after all. Charlotte Bristol had known who Cecil Crawford was before she ever walked up to that shooting line. She had heard his name first from old Ezra Finch, the freight driver who made the run between Durango and Silverton twice a month, and who carried gossip as freely as he carried grain sacks. Cecil Crawford, Ezra had said, was the kind of man mountains were named after in other centuries. He ran the largest cattle operation in Plata County, 3,000 head on open range that his father had claimed before him, and he had added 2,000 more through sheer force of will and an uncanny understanding of the land. He had grown up rough and stayed rough, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he had never found a reason to soften. His father had been a hard man, and his mother had died when Cecil was 11, and the ranch had demanded everything from him since before he was old enough to shave. He was 28 years old and had never proposed to anyone, though several women in Durango and the surrounding counties had hoped he might. He was not cruel, Ezra had clarified, sensing Charlotte's careful silence as she listened. He was not a man who took pleasure in others' pain. But he was formidable in a way that made people give him space, and he had a competitive streak that ran as deep as bedrock. And he had never, in the memory of any person in Plata County, lost a shooting contest. Charlotte had filed that information away the same way she filed everything, precisely, without emotional embellishment, cross-referenced against what she already knew and what she needed to know. She had come to the Durango Cattle Fair for a specific reason, and it had nothing to do with Cecil Crawford at first. She had come because she needed to sell 32 head of prime Hereford cattle, bred on the Bristol ranch that her father had left her 3 years ago when the consumption finally took him, and she needed to sell them at a price that would cover the debt she had inherited along with the land. The bank in Durango held a note against the Bristol property, $4,200, due in full by the 1st of November, and the only way Charlotte was going to meet that deadline was to get top dollar for every animal she had driven to this fair across 40 miles of mountain terrain with only herself, her hired hand Tomás Ruiz, and a border collie named Compass. The shooting contest had not been in her plan. But when she arrived at the fairgrounds that morning and heard Cecil Crawford's booming voice issuing his challenge, heard the terms of the wager, $50 to any man who could outshoot him, she had done the arithmetic in her head in the space of 3 heartbeats and made her decision. $50 was $50, and Charlotte Bristol did not lose shooting contests. She had learned to shoot from her father, Robert Bristol, a former cavalry sharpshooter who had served in the Civil War, and carried both the skill and the silence of that experience into everything he did afterward. He had taught Charlotte the same way he had learned, with rigorous discipline, with patience, with a demand for precision that left no room for excuses. By the time Charlotte was 15, she could outshoot every man on their ranch. By the time she was 20, she had refined her technique to something approaching art, building on her father's foundation with her own relentless practice and a natural ability to read wind, distance, and light that bordered on the instinctive. She was 26 years old, and she had inherited her father's ranch, his debt, his rifle, and his absolute refusal to be defeated by circumstances. What she had not inherited, and what no one had given her, was any assistance with the crushing reality of running a cattle operation alone in the Colorado mountains in 1883. The neighboring ranchers had been skeptical when Robert Bristol died and left everything to his daughter. Some had been openly contemptuous. One of them, a man named Harlan Beets, who ran a middling operation 3 miles south of the Bristol land, had tried to purchase her property at a price so insultingly low that Charlotte had shown him the door without a word, and then spent 40 minutes afterward in the barn with her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of containing her fury. She had not sold to Harlan Beets. She had not sold to anyone. She had worked the ranch herself, with Tomás's help and Compass's unwavering loyalty, and she had built her herd from the 12 animals her father left her to the 32 she was selling today, and she intended to use this sale to clear the debt and start again on solid ground. What she had not anticipated was how complicated that plan would become the moment Cecil Crawford turned from the shooting line, looked at her with those storm-dark eyes beneath the brim of his battered Stetson, and said, in a voice rough enough to scrape paint off a barn door, "I'll be damned." She had expected hostility. She had half expected him to refuse to honor the wager, to find some technical objection, to use his considerable influence to walk away from $50 rather than hand it to a woman. That was the kind of man she had prepared herself for, based on everything Ezra Finch had told her. What she had not prepared herself for was the way Cecil Crawford reached into his vest pocket, produced a $50 bill without a moment's hesitation, and held it out to her with an expression on his face that she could only describe as honest. "Fair's fair," he said. "That was the finest shot I have seen in my natural life, and I have seen some shots." Charlotte took the money. She kept her expression neutral, her chin level, her eyes meeting his directly the way her father had always taught her, because a person who cannot hold your gaze is a person who does not believe they belong in the room, and Charlotte Bristol had always believed she belonged in every room she entered. "Thank you," she said. "You've got a name?" he asked, not rudely. Almost she searched for the right word, almost carefully. "Charlotte Bristol," she said. "Robert Bristol's daughter. We run Herefords up in the North Valley near Cascade Creek." Something moved across his face at that. Recognition, she thought, and something else she could not immediately name. "I know that land," he said. "Good country." "It is," she agreed and turned to walk away because she had cattle to sell and a debt to reckon with, and she could not afford to stand here basking in whatever strange energy was crackling between them like lightning before a thunderstorm. She was 3 steps gone when he spoke again. "Miss Bristol." His voice had changed, lost some of its rawness, taken on a quality she had not expected from a man of his reputation, something that was almost tentative. "I'd like to see those Herefords of yours." She stopped walking, did not turn around immediately, took 1 breath, then 2, then turned. "You looking to buy?" she asked. "I might be," he said. And that expression was still on his face, that open, somewhat dazed look of a man standing on new ground. "I'd have to see the animals." Charlotte studied him for a moment. Cecil Crawford was taller than she had expected even from the stories, well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his life doing actual physical labor rather than simply supervising it. There was dust on his boots and a small scar along the left side of his jaw that spoke of some old argument with something sharp. His hands were large and weathered, and they were currently hanging at his sides without tension, which was either genuine ease or very good control. She had learned to read people the way she read landscape, for what it actually told her, not for what she wanted it to say. He was not performing. The interest was real. "Pen 17, she said. "Come by when you're ready." She walked away then, and she did not look back, though every nerve in her body was aware of his gaze following her across the fairground. Tomás Ruiz was waiting at Pen 17 with Compass at his heels and a skeptical expression on his broad, sun-darkened face. Tomás had been with the Bristol ranch since Charlotte was 12 years old, and he had known her father well, and he treated Charlotte with a combination of genuine respect and brotherly suspicion that she found both irritating and deeply comforting. "I saw what you did," he said without preamble. "Good," she said. "That was $50. "I also saw Cecil Crawford watching you walk over here," he said. Charlotte checked the gate latch on Pen 17 with unnecessary thoroughness. "He's interested in the cattle," she said. Tomás made a sound that was technically agreement but conveyed significant doubt. "Tomás," she said, turning to face him, "I need to sell these animals today. At the right price. I need $4,200 by November 1st, and we have 32 head of Herefords and a $50 shooting prize. Help me focus." Tomás straightened and put away whatever else he had been about to say. He was a good man, Tomás Ruiz. He understood when the moment called for practicality. They spent the next hour checking over the cattle, making sure the animals were watered and calm after the drive, brushing out the worst of the trail dust from the lead bull, a massive, deep-chested animal Charlotte had named Goliath, which she privately thought was the best name she had ever given anything. She discussed prices with 2 other buyers who came by, a livestock merchant from New Mexico and a ranch foreman from up near Ouray, and she received respectable but insufficient offers from both. Cecil Crawford arrived at Pen 17 just after 2 in the afternoon, alone, which surprised her. A man of his standing at a cattle fair usually moved with at least 1 hand or associate in tow. He came without ceremony and went directly to the fence rail and leaned on it, studying Goliath with the focused attention of someone who genuinely understood what he was looking at. Charlotte stood beside him after a moment and let him look. "That bull," he said, without looking at her. "Goliath," she said, 3 years old, 4,200 pounds. He sired 11 calves on this drive's mothers alone, and every one of them has held true to type. What are you asking? She quoted him her price for the full 32 head. She quoted it without apology or softening, at the top of what the market would bear for prime Herefords in September 1883 in southwest Colorado. He was quiet for a moment. That's a strong number, he said. It's a fair number, she said, for what I'm offering. You know beef prices in Denver right now. You know what it costs to source quality breeding stock from the eastern range. These animals are acclimated to mountain altitude, they're healthy, they're well-bred, and that bull will pay for himself in 2 seasons. He turned from the fence and looked at her, and this time the look lasted long enough that she felt it the way you feel heat from a fire, not uncomfortable but unmistakably present. How long have you been running this operation? He asked. 3 years on my own, she said. My father started the herd 12 years ago. And before that, I was learning, she said simply. Something in her tone must have carried more weight than she intended, because he heard something in it. She could tell by the slight shift in his expression, the way his jaw moved as if he were reconsidering something he had assumed. You mentioned your father's land, he said. Robert Bristol, he passed a few years back. He did, she said. I'm sorry for that, he said, and it was not a social formula. He said it the way a person says something they mean. He had a reputation as a man who understood cattle. He did, Charlotte said again. Then, because something in his sincerity compelled it, he taught me everything he knew, and I've spent 3 years learning the rest. Cecil Crawford was quiet for another moment, looking at Goliath, who had moved to the far end of the pen and was regarding them both with the self-possessed dignity of a bull who knew his own worth. I'll take the 32 head, Cecil said, at your price. Charlotte kept her expression steady. Inside her chest, something that had been wound tight for 3 years released a single coil. Not all of it, not yet, but one coil. I'll need bank draft or coin, she said. No extended notes. I deal in bank draft, he said. We can settle it at the assay office before closing. Then we have a deal, she said, and extended her right hand. He shook it. His grip was exactly what she had expected, firm, unperforming, the grip of someone who took handshakes seriously. His palm was rough and warm against hers, and the contact lasted precisely the correct amount of time and no longer, which told her something about him that she filed carefully away. He released her hand, but he did not move to leave. The afternoon light was angling westward, throwing long gold bars across the fairgrounds, and the sounds of the fair livestock, music from a fiddle somewhere near the food stalls, the constant negotiation of commerce washed around them without quite reaching in. Charlotte was aware, suddenly and without wanting to be, of how close they were standing, near enough that she could see the individual lines around his eyes the way they deepened when he was thinking. Miss Bristol, he said, can I ask you something that is none of my business? You can ask, she said. I'll decide whether to answer. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but its structural precursor. Fair enough, he said. Are you managing that operation alone up there? I have one hired hand, she said. Tomás Ruiz. He's been with the ranch since I was a girl. One hand for 32 head and however many acres of mountain range, he said. It was not quite a statement of doubt. It was the observation of someone doing math. It is what it is, she said, which was her way of saying she had not asked for his opinion on the matter. He looked at her steadily. I'm not saying it as a criticism, he said. I'm saying it because it's a hard situation and you're handling it, and I respect that. He paused. My father started this ranch with 2 hands and 15 animals. I know what that kind of arithmetic looks like from the inside. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She was resorting what she knew about him, updating her mental landscape the way you update a map when you discover a river that wasn't marked. Your father passed as well, she said. She knew this from Ezra's account. 5 years ago, he said, fever. His voice did not change on this, but something in him did briefly, like a shadow crossing a field. Left me the ranch and a mortgage that would have swallowed a lesser man. But it didn't swallow you, she said. No, he said. It did not. They stood for a moment in the kind of silence that is not empty but full of the understanding that they were two people who had been handed hard things and had not put them down, and that this was rarer than it should be. "I've been rude to you," he said then, which surprised her so completely that she almost laughed. "You purchased 32 head of cattle at my asking price," she said. "Before that," he said, "the contest this morning I was—" He stopped, seemed to search for the word with genuine effort. "I was putting on a show. I do that, it's a bad habit." "You were also surprised," she said. "I was very surprised," he agreed, and now that almost smile became something more definite, and it changed his whole face in a way she had not been prepared for. It made him look younger and less armored and unexpectedly warm. "I've been shooting since I could hold a rifle. I've never been outshot." "You've been outshot today," she said. "I have," he said, and he did not say it with bitterness. He said it with something that was almost admiration. "At 400 yards with a Winchester and no rest." He shook his head slightly as if the memory of the shot still occupied some wondering corner of his mind. "How long did it take you to learn to shoot like that?" "My whole life," she said, which was true in every way. He nodded slowly, and this time the silence that followed had a different quality to it, a considering quality. As if he were standing at the edge of a decision, looking at the ground on the other side, trying to judge the distance. "Miss Bristol," he said, "I wonder if you'd allow me to walk with you this afternoon, while the fair is still going. I have no other agenda on that front. I've done my business for the day, and I'm a man who walks better when he has somewhere to walk to." Another pause. "And I find I'd like to keep talking to you." Charlotte studied him. In her experience, men who said things like, "I have no other agenda," almost always had an agenda. But the contest between what her instincts said about Cecil Crawford and what his reputation suggested was running about even at this point, and she was a woman who trusted her instincts above received wisdom. "I have cattle to see settled before sundown," she said. "After that, I have no objection." He helped her settle the cattle. This was not something she had asked for, and it was not something she had expected, and it told her more about him than anything else so far. He did not supervise or advise. He took off his good vest and rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside her and Tamaz, moving animals with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent the majority of his life working livestock, communicating with compass through hand signals the dog immediately understood, because a good working dog recognizes competence regardless of who is displaying it. Tamaz, for his part, said nothing. But Charlotte caught the glance he sent her from across the pen, a single, loaded look that contained approximately 4 separate opinions, and she chose to ignore every one of them. By the time the 32 head were settled, watered, and accounted for in the fair's registration ledger, the sun was dropping toward the San Juan Mountains, and the air had taken on the cooler, thinner quality of a Colorado September evening. The fair's afternoon energy had mellowed into something slower and more golden, the crowds thinning out between the pens and thickening around the food stalls, and the area near the livestock hall, where a 4-piece string ensemble had set up and was playing for anyone who cared to listen. Charlotte washed her hands at the pump near the fair's central water trough, and Cecil Crawford was standing nearby, having done the same, his sleeves still rolled and his hair damp at the temples from the work, and he looked considerably less polished than he had that morning, but considerably more real. "The assay office closes at 6, he said. "We have time." "Then let's go now," she said, "before something else comes up." He laughed at that, short and genuine, and she felt it like a small explosion in her chest that she immediately categorized as irrelevant and filed under things to examine later. They walked to the assay office together through the fairgrounds, and more than one person stopped to watch them pass. Charlotte was aware of this, aware of the speculation it would generate, aware that Durango was a small enough community that 2 people walking together meant something whether you wanted it to or not. She did not alter her pace or her posture. The assay office transaction took 20 minutes. The clerk, A meticulous man named Whitmore who wore spectacles and seemed constitutionally incapable of a careless movement, counted out the bank draft twice and had both parties sign the transfer documentation before stamping it with the county seal. When the transaction was complete and Charlotte folded the draft into the inner pocket of her riding jacket close to her body, the way her father had taught her to carry anything valuable, she felt the weight of it like a physical reality, like proof that the thing she had been working toward was actually happening. $4,300, her asking price, plus the $50 from the contest. She needed $4,200 for the bank note. She had $100 left over. It was not much of a cushion, but it was a cushion, and Charlotte Bristol had slept on thinner ones. They walked out of the assay office into the cooling evening air, and Cecil Crawford looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "You needed that money," he said. "It was not a question." "Everyone needs money," she said. "No," he said, simply and without judgment. "I mean you specifically needed what I just paid you. There was something riding on it." He watched her face. "You don't have to tell me what. I'm not asking for that. I just want you to know that I recognized it." Charlotte looked at him steadily. She felt, for the first time in 3 years, the strange vertigo of being genuinely seen by another person, not partially seen, not seen for what she could provide or what she represented, but seen as herself, with the full complexity of her situation understood and respected. It was an uncomfortable feeling, as it happened. She was more accustomed to invisibility than to this. "My father left a mortgage on the property," she said, "because his honesty seemed to call for some honesty in return. It comes due November 1st. What I receive today will cover it." He absorbed this without commentary, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated sympathy. "Then I'm glad the price was fair," he said. "It was fair because the cattle were worth it," she said, with the small edge that automatically entered her voice when she suspected she was being managed. "It was fair because the cattle were worth it," he agreed, with no edge at all. "I wouldn't have paid more than they were worth just to help someone out. That's not how I do business. And you know that's not how you wanted it done either." She did know that. He was exactly right, and knowing that he was right settled something that had been bristling. "No," she said. "I don't want charity. I never have." "I know," he said. "I could tell that the moment you walked up to that shooting line." They were near the area where the string ensemble was playing an old fiddle waltz that Charlotte half recognized, something her father had hummed sometimes in the evenings when he thought no one was listening. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasted corn and horse, and above them the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky, faint and tentative, as if they were still deciding whether the night was ready for them. "Will you walk a little more?" he asked. She should have said no. She had Tamaz waiting and a bedroll in the wagon, and an early start tomorrow for the 40-mile drive back to the ranch. She had practical reasons to say good night and go. "A little more," she said. They walked along the edge of the fairground where the crowd was thinnest, between the back pens and the temporary corral fence, and the conversation deepened the way conversations do when the social performance of daytime has given way to the more honest territory of evening. He asked her about the ranch, about the specific challenges of the North Valley terrain, and she answered in detail because the subject interested her, and because his questions revealed genuine understanding of cattle and land, and the particular difficulties of the Colorado high country. She asked him about his operation, and he described it with the pride and specificity of a man who has built something and knows what it cost him. "You've never married," she said, at some point, which was perhaps more direct than was conventional, but she had never had much patience for the conventional indirection that was supposed to govern conversations between men and women on such subjects. He looked at her sidelong and the almost smile was back. "I have not," he said. "There have been," he chose the next word carefully, "expectations at various times from various quarters." "But not yours," she said. "Never mine," he said. "I've been waiting for something." "What were you waiting for?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for the string ensemble to finish one song and begin another, a slower one this time, something that wound through the cooling air with a kind of sweet gravity. "Honestly," he said. "Please," she said. "I didn't know," he said. "Until today I couldn't have named it. I just knew that the right thing hadn't happened yet." He stopped walking. They were near the far edge of the fairground, beyond the noise and the light, where the dusk had settled into something close to dark blue, and the mountains were becoming shadows of themselves against the paler sky. "Miss Bristol, Charlotte," he said her given name with the careful deliberateness of a man who was aware of what he was doing. "I am aware that what I am about to say is going to sound completely unreasonable." She turned to face him fully. There was enough light from the fairground behind them that she could see his expression clearly. And what she saw there was the thing she had least expected to find on the face of a man with his reputation. It was vulnerability. Not weakness. The distinction was important and she understood it instinctively, but the honest, visible exposure of a person putting something real and unprotected into the open air. "Say it anyway," she said. "I would like to come and call on you," he said. "Formally. At your ranch." With the intention of another pause, longer this time, as if the words were things he had to find one at a time. With serious intentions. "I'm not a man who does things partway, and I'm not trying to flatter you or gain something I haven't earned. But I have spent most of a day in your company, and I find that I am not interested in ending it, and I have enough self-knowledge to recognize when something matters." Charlotte stood very still in the Colorado evening and looked at Cecil Crawford. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. Not the $50 from the contest, not the cattle sale at her asking price, not the genuine conversation, not this man who was rougher than the mountains around him, and somehow also this. She thought about the ranch, and the debt that was now paid, and the 32 cattle she had raised and sold, and the 3 years she had spent learning that you do not need another person to survive. She thought about her father, who had been a solitary man, and about the silence of the North Valley in winter when the snow came down, and the world reduced itself to the sound of wind and the low voices of cattle. She thought about Tomás, who was probably eating his supper right now with Compass at his feet, and who would give her that look tomorrow morning on the drive home, the look that contained approximately 4 opinions. She thought about the way Cecil Crawford had rolled up his sleeves and worked her cattle without being asked. She thought about the way he had shaken her hand. "My ranch is 40 miles up the mountain," she said. "The road turns bad past the Animas River ford." "I've ridden worse," he said. "The weather in November is unpredictable," she said. "I have a good horse," he said. "Tomás will disapprove," she said. This one made him blink, and then the not-quite smile became the fully committed version, the one that changed his whole face, and Charlotte felt that small explosion again, and this time did not file it under irrelevant. There was no point in misfilling evidence. "I'll bring a good bottle of whiskey," he said, as a gesture of goodwill. "Tomás doesn't drink," she said. "Then I'll bring molasses," he said. "Everyone approves of molasses." Charlotte looked at this man, this rough, competent, surprisingly sincere man who had lost to her at his own game, and responded not with anger or deflection, but with a kind of honest wonder that had been reshaping itself all afternoon into something larger, and she made a decision. "All right," she said. "You may call on me. But I want to be clear about something first." "Name it," he said, and he was listening completely, the way people listen when they know the next words matter. "I am not looking for someone to take over my ranch," she said. "I am not looking for a partner who will gradually become the person making decisions while I become the person nodding at them. I have spent 3 years learning to run my operation, and I intend to keep running it. If you come to call on me with some expectation of finding a woman you can domesticate, you will waste your time and mine." He held her gaze throughout this without flinching, without the defensive bristle she had half expected, without the careful reassurance of a man who was telling her what she wanted to hear. He heard her. He actually heard her. "Charlotte," he said. You outshot me at 400 yards this afternoon. You negotiated a cattle sale at your asking price in a market full of men who would have tried to take you apart. You drove 32 head 40 miles through the mountains with one hand and a dog. He paused. I am not looking to domesticate anything. I wouldn't know how. I'm looking for someone who meets the world the way I do, and I have been looking for a long time. He held out his hand, not the way he would close a business deal, but differently, open-palmed, unhurried, as if offering something rather than sealing something. Those are my intentions. You can decide what to do with them. She looked at his hand. Then she shook it. Firmly, the same as before. The contact lasted a little longer this time, and when they both let go, neither of them immediately looked away. October, she said. Come in October before the first snow. I'll come before October is out, he said. They stood for another moment in the blue-dark Colorado evening, the music from the string ensemble reaching them in fragments, the mountains looming invisible and enormous beyond the fairground lights. And Charlotte Bristol was aware of standing at the edge of something she had not planned for and could not fully chart, and finding, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was not afraid of it. She rode out of Durango the next morning before the sun was fully up, with Tamaz on the wagon seat beside her and Compass trotting faithfully alongside, and the bank draft folded close against her body, and the memory of the previous evening sitting in her mind with a strange, warm persistence. Tamaz waited until they had forded the Animas and were climbing the first switchback out of the river valley before he said anything. He wants to court you, he said. It was not a question. He's going to come calling in October, she said, keeping her eyes on the road. Tamaz was quiet for a moment. The wagon groaned on the switchback. Compass flushed a grouse out of the brush and then came back, looking pleased with himself. He's a hard man, Tamaz said. Yes, she said. Your father was a hard man, Tamaz said. Yes, she said again. Your father was also a good man, Tamaz said, and left it there, which was a more generous assessment than Charlotte had expected from him. She spent the remainder of September doing what she had always done, working. She paid the bank note in person at the Durango branch, watching the clerk cancel it with his stamp, and felt something enormous lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying so long she had partially forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. She used the remaining $100 to purchase winter supplies and a new roll of barbed wire for the south fence line, which had been failing since spring. She thought about Cecil Crawford at odd moments, while she was checking fence, while she was doctoring a lame steer, while she was doing the accounts by lamplight in the evenings. She thought about him the way you think about a problem you haven't fully solved, with a combination of focused attention and deliberate restraint, because you know that throwing your whole mind at it too soon can actually make it harder to think clearly. She wondered if he would actually come. Men made intentions in the warm light of a September fair and let them cool in the ordinary temperature of daily life. She knew this. She did not permit herself to want him to come so specifically that disappointment would be waiting if he didn't. She was checking the north fence line on a bright, cold morning in the third week of October when she heard hoofbeats on the ranch road. She did not turn around immediately. She finished the section of wire she was inspecting, straightened, tucked her gloves into her belt, and then turned. Cecil Crawford was riding a tall bay gelding that moved with the smooth, covering stride of a horse bred for distance, and he had a pack behind the saddle that suggested he had brought provisions rather than expecting to be a short visit. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and his working Stetson rather than his fair day attire, and he looked, if anything, more real than he had in Durango, the way things often look more real when the context is your own territory rather than public ground. He pulled up near the fence line. "You're fixing wire," he observed. "I am," she said. "The staples in this section," he asked, dismounting. She looked at him. Then she pulled her spare staple hammer from her belt and handed it to him. They worked the north fence line for 2 hours without making much conversation, but the silence had the same quality as the silence at the fair, not empty, but full. They worked well together, which surprised her less than she thought it should. Afterward, at the ranch house, she made coffee on the wood stove and Tamaz came in from the barn and regarded Cecil Crawford with a measuring look that would have made lesser men uncomfortable. Cecil met it evenly and said, "I brought molasses," and produced a substantial jar from his pack, setting it on the kitchen table with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who had paid attention. Tamaz looked at the jar. Then he looked at Cecil Crawford. Then he sat down at the table, which was essentially the highest form of acceptance available in Tamaz Ruiz's vocabulary. Cecil stayed 3 days. He slept in the barn. There was no question of any other arrangement, and he did not suggest one, and he worked during the days. Not because Charlotte asked him to, and not because he was performing helpfulness, but because he seemed constitutionally unable to observe useful work going undone while he had 2 functional hands. He helped Tamaz repair the south fence, helped Charlotte move the remaining herd to the lower pasture for winter grazing, and spent an entire afternoon helping her recalculate the winter feed plan based on the current herd size and the projected weather. This last was where she first saw the full extent of his mind. She had known he was intelligent. You could not build the operation he had built by being otherwise, but watching him work through a complex feeding calculation, asking precise questions about her herd's individual characteristics, adapting his assumptions based on her answers with the flexibility of someone genuinely interested in being right rather than appearing right. She understood that there was considerably more going on behind those storm-dark eyes than his public persona of rough-hewn cattleman suggested. She told him this on the 3rd evening when they were sitting on the porch in the sharp October cold with cups of coffee, watching the stars appear above the mountains with that spectacular profligacy that happens at high altitude, as if the sky is less selective about what it shows when there is less human noise to compete with. "You're smarter than you let people see," she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I spent a long time learning that being the roughest man in the room was safer than being the smartest," he said. "Rough men don't have to explain themselves. Smart men do." "Safer in what way?" she asked. "My father valued strength," he said carefully. He had no patience for what he called book-headedness. He was not a cruel man, but his world was very specific and it did not have much room in it for a son who liked to do figures in his spare time. Charlotte looked at the stars and thought about this. "My father valued precision," she said, "in shooting, in thinking, in everything. He was not interested in gender as a category. He was interested in capability." She paused. "He taught me everything he would have taught a son. Sometimes I think that was his greatest act of love." "It produced something remarkable," Cecil said. The word hung between them in the cold air. Charlotte did not deflect it or diminish it. She let it stand. "I know what I am," she said. "I've had to know because no one was going to tell me." He turned his head and looked at her, and in the starlight his expression was open in a way she had not seen from him in daylight, the particular openness of the dark, when the defenses that the visible world requires come partially down. "Charlotte," he said. "Cecil," she said, and used his given name for the first time and felt the small weight of it, the way names carry their people inside them. "I would like to come back," he said, "after the winter, in spring, and I would like to," he stopped, started again. "I am going to say something that I have never said to anyone, and I want to say it honestly and not in a way that pressures you or creates an obligation, because you are not a woman who responds well to pressure, and I am not a man who wants to create obligations that aren't freely chosen." A breath. "I think I am falling in love with you. I think it started at the shooting line in Durango, when you hit that clay pigeon and I was standing there feeling like the ground had tilted under me. And I think it has continued in every conversation we have had since. And I think if I spend the winter 3 counties away, not seeing you, I am going to find it very difficult." Charlotte was quiet for a long time. The mountains stood their enormous dark watch around them, and the stars burned above, and somewhere in the lower pasture a steer made the low, rumbling sound cattle make when they are comfortable and settled. She thought about what it meant to love someone who understood what you were. She thought about what it meant to be seen not despite your strength, but because of it. She thought about the north fence and the winter feed plan, and the molasses on the kitchen table, and the 3 days of silence that had been more eloquent than most conversations she had ever had. "I think," she said slowly and with precision, because she was her father's daughter and she did not say things she did not mean, "that something is happening in me as well. I'm not going to name it yet because I'm not certain of it yet, and I won't say I'm certain until I am. But I'm not asking you not to come back." He took a slow breath. "That's enough," he said, and he meant it not as a resignation but as a genuine statement of sufficiency. He left the next morning, and he shook Charlotte's hand on the porch and shook Tomas's hand at the barn, and told Compass he was a good dog, which Compass received with dignified appreciation. Charlotte watched him ride down the ranch road and disappear around the first bend toward the valley, and Tomas came to stand beside her. "He'll be back," Tomas said. "I know," she said. "You're not worried about it," Tomas said, and this was a statement of surprise because he knew her well enough to know that she was generally worried about most things, because worry was the appropriate response to a world that was not arranged for your convenience. "No," she said, "I'm not." The winter was hard, as Colorado winters always were, and Charlotte had no time to be romantic about anything. She was managing her herd through 3 separate snow events, repairing the barn roof after an ice slide damaged the eastern section, doctoring 2 animals through a respiratory illness that nearly cost her the smaller heifer, and doing all of it in temperatures that dropped sometimes to 20 below zero, at which point even the good wool coat and the fur-lined gloves her father had left her were not quite enough. She received 3 letters from Cecil Crawford over the winter. Not love letters in any conventional sense, no flowery language, no poetic flourishes. They were letters about cattle and land and the specific challenges of the Plata County winter, interspersed with occasional observations about what he had read. He was apparently a reader, which she had suspected, and questions about what was happening on her ranch. They were letters that treated her as an intelligent person engaged in the same essential work he was. And they were, Charlotte thought, reading the third one by lamplight with Compass's head on her foot, the most romantic things anyone had ever sent her. She wrote back with equal practicality and similar warmth, and the correspondence developed across the dark months of winter with the particular intimacy of 2 people who have decided to show each other their actual thinking. He came in March, when the first thaw was beginning and the valley roads were mud-slick but passable. He came with his pack horse carrying some lumber she had mentioned needing in her last letter, which she had mentioned only in passing and entirely practically, and which he had therefore brought because that was apparently how he listened. She was in the barn when she heard him come in, and she came out into the thin March sunshine and looked at him on his tall bay horse and felt the thing she had not named in October unfolding further into definition. "You came early," she said. "The roads were passable," he said. He dismounted and she saw that his jaw was heavier with a winter's worth of beard, and his coat was more beaten than it had been in October, and he was more beautiful to her now than he had been then, which was information she processed carefully. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "Charlotte," he said, and something in his voice made her stop and turn. He was standing beside his horse with an expression on his face that was somewhere between the fair and the porch, open, honest, and also containing something new, something that had developed over the winter months and was now presenting itself in the March light as a statement. "I need to say something before the coffee," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking about this since October," he said. "I've been thinking about it clearly and without romance and with every practical consideration that a man of my experience and resources can bring to bear." He met her eyes with the directness that was the most consistent thing about him. "I want to marry you. Not to absorb your ranch into mine, not to manage your decisions for you, not to change anything fundamental about how you live and work, but to come here, or to find some arrangement that serves both our operations, and to build something with you, the way you build things, which is with both eyes open and both hands working. He paused. I understand if you need more time. I'm not going to be diminished by waiting if that's what you need. But I wanted to name it, because I know you prefer directness to maneuvering. Charlotte stood in the March mud in front of her barn and looked at this man who had lost to her at his own game and honored the loss, who had paid her asking price without condescension, who had brought lumber because she had mentioned needing it, who had spent a winter writing her letters that treated her like an equal and a person of substance. And she let herself feel, completely and without restraint, what had been accumulating since September. I need to ask you something first, she said. Ask, he said. If we marry, she said, and I disagree with you about how something should be done with the ranch or the cattle or anything that affects our shared life, what happens? He thought about it, not for show but genuinely as if it were a real question deserving a real answer. We argue, he said, and then we look at the evidence and the person who is right gets to be right, regardless of which of us it is. He paused again. I am not always going to be right. I know this. You showed me on the first day we met. And if we can't agree, she asked, then we find a third path, he said. That is what intelligent people do. Charlotte breathed in March air cold still, carrying the smell of snowmelt and new mud and the first faint biological stirring of things about to grow, and she made another decision. The biggest one she had ever made, larger even than the one to keep the ranch after her father died, because this one was not about survival. This one was about something beyond survival, something her father had called in one of his rarer tender moments the good part. Yes, she said. He was very still for a moment as if he needed a second to be certain he had heard correctly. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. Cecil Crawford, I will marry you, on the conditions stated. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and stood very close to her, and he reached up and put one of his rough, warm hands against her jaw with a gentleness that was as striking as anything she had seen from him, and he looked at her with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated happiness that she felt it like sunlight after a very long winter. Those are my conditions too, he said, quietly. Those have always been my conditions. He kissed her then, soft and unhurried, and with the characteristic thoroughness he brought to everything. And it was exactly what she would have predicted, complete, honest, and nothing like what she had expected. They were married in Durango in May of 1884, at the county courthouse rather than in a church, because Charlotte had always thought that the law was a more reliable witness than ceremony, and Cecil had agreed with this assessment without discussion. Tomás served as one witness and Cecil's ranch foreman, a quiet Tejano man named Aurelio Garza who had been with the Crawford Ranch for 6 years, served as the other. The justice of the peace, a myopic man named Judge Holloway who had married approximately 200 couples in his tenure and had developed an economy of expression about the enterprise, performed the ceremony with brisk efficiency, and seemed genuinely surprised when both parties delivered their vows with the focused attention of people who were listening to what they were promising. Afterward, they had lunch at the hotel restaurant, a place with white tablecloths that seemed faintly absurd to all 4 of them, and drank a bottle of wine that was expensive enough to justify the occasion, and talked for 2 hours about practical matters and impractical ones in roughly equal proportion. The practical matter that occupied most of the conversation was the question of the ranches. They had discussed this across the winter letters, but it required resolution now that it was real. The Crawford Ranch was larger and better established, with more hands and better-built structures. The Bristol Ranch had good land, that North Valley terrain with its particular grass, and its reliable water from Cascade Creek, and Goliath, who was now producing calves in Cecil's herd that were confirming everything Charlotte had promised about him. What they decided, over the white tablecloths and the wine that was too good for lunch, was this: They would operate both properties as a single enterprise under a shared name, the Bristol Crawford Ranch, which Charlotte had suggested and Cecil had accepted without a counteroffer, with each property managed according to its specific strengths. Cecil would continue to direct the main operation from the larger ranch, and Charlotte would manage the North Valley property, bringing Tamaz with her, using Cascade Creek and the mountain terrain for the summer grazing that the lower ranch could not provide. It was, Charlotte thought, an elegant solution. It used what each of them actually had, rather than assuming that one thing had to subsume the other. Tamaz, when informed of this plan, produced a relatively approving silence, which was the loudest possible expression of his satisfaction. Charlotte moved most of her household goods to the Crawford Ranch, which was larger, better insulated, and had a kitchen that did not require the cast-iron stove to be coaxed into cooperation every morning. But she rode out to the North Valley 3 mornings a week and managed it as a distinct operation, keeping her own accounts and making her own decisions on its management while sharing the aggregate numbers with Cecil at the end of each week. Cecil, in turn, made a point of riding out with her sometimes and asking her questions about the North Valley's specific challenges and adapting his broader operational plans accordingly. He was, she discovered, genuinely willing to change his mind when presented with good evidence, which was rarer in a human being than any other quality she could name. They fought, of course. Charlotte had not expected a life without conflict, and she would not have trusted one if she found it. They fought about grazing rotation plans, and about the timing of the fall drive, and about whether to hire additional hands in the spring, and about a fence dispute with Harlan Beets, Charlotte's old nemesis from 3 miles south. That escalated briefly into something that required both of them to agree on a strategy before either of them opened their mouth, because Harlan Beets was the kind of man who would exploit a division. They stood together in that particular fight, Charlotte and Cecil, in Harlan Beets's front yard on a day in July 1884 when the dust was up and the air tasted of hot iron, and Charlotte laid out the property boundary evidence. She had the original survey documents, had always had them, kept them in a metal case under her father's desk, with the calm precision of someone who knows they are right and can prove it, while Cecil stood at her shoulder like a mountain range. Present, immovable, and requiring no explanation, Harlan Beets, confronted with both, folded faster than a tent in a thunderstorm. Driving back to the ranch afterward, Cecil said, "You knew he'd fold." "I did," she said. "He's always needed someone he could frighten. He tried to buy my ranch at half value the week after my father died. He thought a grieving woman alone would be easier than the truth." "He was wrong," Cecil said. "He was very wrong," she said, and looked at the road ahead with the particular satisfaction of someone for whom being right has always cost something and who has learned to feel the value of it. The first winter of their marriage was easier than the previous one, not because the weather was gentler, but because there were 2 of them, which meant the work was shared, and the evenings were not solitary, and Charlotte discovered that she had missed the evenings without knowing it, had been filling them with books and accounts and lamp work without realizing she was filling a space that had a different natural tenant. They spent the evenings reading, sometimes, or talking about the ranch, or playing chess, which Cecil turned out to be competent at, and which Charlotte turned out to be better at, a fact Cecil acknowledged with the same straightforward acceptance he had shown at the shooting line in Durango, which somehow made winning less important than the playing. He loved her. She understood that winter. He loved her in a way she had not quite prepared herself for, not because it was overwhelming or dramatic, but because it was constant. The steady, reliable warmth of it present in his attention to what she said, in the way he deferred to her judgment on the North Valley operations without making a performance of deferring, in the way he looked at her across the dinner table when she was doing the accounts, and she looked up and found him watching her with that expression that had first appeared at the Durango Cattle Fair and had never entirely left his face. She loved him back. She had known this for longer than she had admitted it to herself, which was typical of her. She waited until she was certain before she named things. But that winter she let herself be certain, and the certainty was large and quiet and permanent, like the mountains. In the spring of 1885, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this information alone for a day before she told Cecil, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she needed to first understand how she herself felt about it. A process she had always believed in, regardless of what the feeling turned out to be. She felt, in roughly equal parts, terrified, exhilarated, and determined. Which was, she reflected, approximately the same three-part response she had to most significant challenges in her life, so there was a certain consistency to it. She told Cecil in the evening after supper, in the clear and direct way she told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and he looked at her with an expression that was new. She was still cataloging new expressions from this man, which she expected she would be doing for the rest of her life. An expression of something so tender and so unguarded that she felt it reach into parts of her that she had not known were still waiting to be reached. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question was complete. He was asking about all of her, every dimension, not just the physical. "I will be," she said. "I am." "Good," he said. Then very quietly, "Charlotte, I am going to be a father." "You are," she said. "My father was." He stopped. "I am going to do it differently," he said. There was a conviction in his voice that she recognized because she had heard it when he talked about the ranch and about hard seasons and about things he had decided. It was the conviction of someone who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at a position they intend to hold. "I know what not to do, and I know what I want to do. I want to be the kind of father who sees his child clearly, who teaches everything worth knowing without sorting it by what the child is." Charlotte thought about her own father, who had done exactly that for her, who had put a rifle in her hands and taught her to see and breathe and still herself at 15 years old, who had died without knowing that she would use everything he gave her to save his ranch, and then to find herself at a shooting line in Durango, changing the direction of her life in one unhesitating pull of a trigger. "You'll be a good father," she said, and she knew it the way she knew other certain things, the way you know the weather is turning, the way you know when livestock are healthy, the way you know when a shot is going to hit. Their son was born in December of 1885, a winter baby, which Charlotte had predicted but not fully prepared herself for in terms of what it actually required of a body in a cold farmhouse at high altitude. He came into the world fierce and loud and already insistent about everything, which Cecil said was the most Bristol thing imaginable, and Charlotte said was entirely Crawford. They named him Robert for Charlotte's father. It had been Cecil's suggestion, offered not as a performance of generosity, but as a simple acknowledgement that Robert Bristol had made Charlotte Bristol possible, and therefore had made everything else possible as well. Robert Crawford turned out to be a child who required full attention from everyone in his vicinity, including Compass, who adapted to being a nursemaid dog with the philosophical flexibility of a working animal that has always been told to be useful, and has internalized this instruction completely. He was dark-eyed like his mother and built heavy through the shoulders like his father, and he had, from approximately 4 months of age, an expression of focused evaluation when looking at new things that made Tamaz say, once, that the boy already had Charlotte's eyes. Tamaz, as it turned out, was enormously fond of the baby. He expressed this fondness in the same way he expressed most things practically, without excess, but he could always be found near wherever Robert was, and Robert's first word, to everyone's amusement except Cecil's, who tried to look less wounded about it than he felt, was a sound that was clearly an attempt at Tamaz's name. Life on the Bristol Crawford Ranch in the years that followed was not easy, because nothing in the Colorado high country was easy, but it was good with the durable, specific goodness of things that have been built honestly with the right materials. Charlotte continued to manage the North Valley property with her own firm hand, and the North Valley herd continued to grow and improve, and Goliath's line was producing animals of such reliable quality that buyers from as far as Kansas City were specifying Crawford Herefords by name. Cecil's main operation expanded southward along the La Plata drainage, and he hired 3 additional hands and contracted with the railroad freight office in Durango for a standing autumn shipment that simplified the sale process considerably. They continued to argue productively and to change each other's minds about things on roughly equal occasions, and to find the third path when neither the first nor the second would do. They continued to read in the evenings and to play chess and to have conversations that ranged from the intensely practical to the occasionally philosophical, in the way of people who are not afraid of the full extent of each other's minds. They continued to discover new things about each other, which Charlotte had expected to diminish over time but which did not, because they were both people of genuine substance, and genuine substance does not exhaust itself. In 1887, Charlotte won the shooting contest at the Durango Cattle Fair again. The organizers had made it an annual event after the inaugural edition had generated such memorable controversy. And Cecil watched from the crowd with his arms folded and a grin on his face that was visible from a considerable distance. Robert, who was 18 months old and being held by Tamaz near the fence rail, pointed at the resulting cloud of clay pigeon dust and said something that sounded like "Mama," and then something that sounded like "Boom," which became the family's primary description of Charlotte's shooting style for approximately the next decade. Cecil did not enter the contest himself. When the contest organizer asked him why, he said, "Because I'd lose," which was honest, and which the organizer repeated to anyone who would listen for the rest of the day. Charlotte's name in La Plata County had changed by this point. It had changed from Robert Bristol's daughter to Crawford's wife to something more accurate and more permanent. She was Charlotte Crawford, the woman who shoots. And there was in this a respect that had been earned at a shooting line on a September afternoon and built upon steadily in every year since. She did not take it for granted. She never took anything for granted. It was one of the most reliable things about her. In 1888, their second child was born, a daughter this time, bright and determined, who they named Eleanor after Cecil's mother, the woman who had died when Cecil was 11, and who he had carried in memory across the decades as a person deserving of being remembered. Eleanor Crawford came into the world with the same insistence Robert had brought to the enterprise, but with what appeared, from very early on, to be a particular interest in the mechanics of things. She took apart everything within reach and put most of it back together, and Charlotte watched this with the recognition of someone seeing a familiar pattern in a new form. By 1890, the Bristol Crawford Ranch was one of the most respected operations in La Plata County. Not the largest, Cecil would tell you. The Turner Ranch to the north had more acreage, but the most consistently productive per acre, the most reliable in quality, and the most innovative in its approach to breeding and grazing management, most of which innovations had come out of the specific observations Charlotte had been making about the North Valley terrain for going on a decade. Aurelio Garza, Cecil's ranch foreman, had by this point become something essential to both the operation and the household, a person of such competence and fundamental decency that Charlotte had come to rely on him completely, and regarded him with the same affection and respect she had for Tamaz, who was aging now, working less than he had been, moving more slowly, spending more time on the bench in the barn in the afternoons in a posture that Charlotte recognized as a man winding down. She sat with Tamaz on that bench one afternoon in the autumn of 1890 and did not pretend that everything was as it had always been, because Charlotte Bristol had never pretended anything. "Are you comfortable?" she asked. "I am," he said, more comfortable than I deserve." He looked at the barn, at the familiar shapes of the equipment and the animals and the way the light came in through the cracks. "Your father would have been very proud of you," he said. "In case you didn't know." Charlotte looked at her hands, which were tanned and calloused and capable. "I know," she said. "He was not a man who said things he didn't mean." "No," Tamaz agreed. "Like someone else I know." They sat together in the autumn barn until the light changed, and it was one of the best hours Charlotte had in that year, which was a year with many good hours. Tamaz Ruiz died in January of 1891, peacefully, in the room Charlotte had given him in the North Valley ranch house when it became clear that he could no longer manage the barn winter mornings. He died with Compass at his feet, Compass, ancient and slow now himself, and Charlotte was with him, sitting on the chair beside his bed, and she held his hand while he slept his last sleep, and afterward she sat for a while in the quiet of the room and let herself grieve for a man who had been with her almost her whole life. Cecil came from the main ranch when she sent word, and he arrived within hours, and he held her in the kitchen of the North Valley house for a long time without saying anything, because he knew, by this point, exactly what Charlotte needed and when she needed it. Compass died 3 weeks after Tamaz, which Charlotte had half expected. They had been companions for so long that the interval made a kind of sense. She buried him next to the North Valley barn, and Robert, who was 5 years old, asked with the directness of a 5-year-old where Compass had gone, and Charlotte answered him exactly as she would have answered an adult because he was her son, and he deserved a real answer. The grief passed, as grief does, into something less acute, into the ongoing presence of the people and animals you have loved, carried forward in the texture of the life they helped you build. They got another dog, a young border collie, red and white, who Robert named Galileo because he had recently learned the name from a book and felt it sounded appropriate, and who turned out to be brilliant and tireless and almost as good as Compass, which was the highest possible praise. In 1892, Charlotte took Robert, who was 7 by then and had begun, like his mother before him, to develop a precise and particular interest in things out to the North Valley shooting range, which was what she called the long flat above the north pasture where she still practiced regularly, and she put a rifle in his hands and began to teach him what her father had taught her. Cecil watched from a distance the first day, leaning on the fence rail with his arms folded, and Charlotte was aware of his watching but did not acknowledge it until the lesson was done and Robert had gone back to the house and she walked over to the fence. "He has your stillness," Cecil said. "He has your patience," she said. They both knew this was a good combination. Eleanor, 2 years younger, watched her brother's shooting lessons from the fence for approximately 4 sessions before announcing that she wanted to shoot too, at which point Charlotte put a rifle in Eleanor's hands and began at the beginning, the same beginning her father had begun with her, and Eleanor was less still than Robert but more instinctive, her natural eye for trajectory and angle compensating for what she was still developing in discipline. "She'll outshoot him in a year," Charlotte said to Cecil one evening doing the accounts. "You think so?" Cecil said, from the other end of the table where he was reading a cattleman's journal. "I know so," Charlotte said. She was right in approximately 18 months rather than 12, because Robert's patience gave him more staying power than she had predicted, but the eventual outcome was as forecast, which Cecil said nothing about except to smile at her from across the dinner table when Eleanor made her first clean shot at 200 yards and whooped with an abandon that Charlotte's own childhood instruction had not permitted. "Let her whoop," Cecil had said, which was parenting advice Charlotte filed and implemented. The years moved the way years do in the Colorado mountains, with the insistence of the seasons, each one demanding its full portion of work and attention, each one offering its full portion of the extraordinary that is always available in a landscape as magnificent as the San Juan Mountains if you have enough willingness to look up from what you are doing. The ranch grew. Not recklessly, but steadily, guided by Charlotte's meticulous management of the North Valley operation and Cecil's larger operational instincts and the improving infrastructure of the territory. The railroad, the expanding market, the slowly improving roads that made the drive to Durango less punishing each year. They hired a second hand for the North Valley operation after Tomás, a young woman named Petra Sandoval who came from a ranching family in the San Luis Valley and who could ride and work livestock with a competence that Charlotte recognized and valued, and who also, as an ancillary benefit, became something of an older sister figure to Alina, who responded to this with great enthusiasm. The cattle fair in Durango became an annual touchstone. They went every year, Charlotte and Cecil together, usually with the children after the children were old enough to manage the distance, and the shooting contest remained Charlotte's territory, and eventually Robert entered it too, and eventually Alina entered it, and the Crawford family participation became a feature of the fair that people looked forward to in the specific way you look forward to things that are reliable and good. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, September of 1893, Cecil rode out to the North Valley Ranch in the morning, which was not unusual, and found Charlotte checking the fall pasture fencing, which was also not unusual, and he leaned on the fence rail and watched her work for a while in the comfortable way of people who have watched each other work for 10 years and still find it worth watching. "Do you know what today is?" he asked, when she came back to the fence line. "The 14th of September, she said. 10 years since Durango," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and 10 years were in both their faces, not as damage but as depth, the way experience marks people who have been living fully rather than carefully. "You proposed before sundown," she said. "Technically." "I did," he said. "It seemed like the right decision at the time." "Was it?" she asked, which was a rhetorical question, and they both knew it. He reached over the fence rail and took her hand, her tanned, calloused, capable hand, and held it with the same care he had shown from the beginning, the same care that had never diminished, that she had come to depend on with the same depth she depended on the North Valley water and the mountain weather and the familiar weight of her Winchester. "The best decision I ever made," he said, after acknowledging that you were the better shot. "Those two things are related," she said. "I know," he said. "I've always known." They stood at the North Valley fence in the September morning, with the San Juan Mountains rising clean and blue above them, and the fall grass moving in the elevation wind, and somewhere down the hill, the sound of Robert and Alina doing something with the dog that involved a great deal of shouted instruction and enthusiastic barking, and the Bristol Crawford ranch all around them in every direction. Built out of 3 years of solitary determination and a shooting contest and a handshake and 10 years of choosing each other daily, with both eyes open. Charlotte thought about the woman who had walked up to that shooting line in Durango in 1883, alone and in debt and absolutely certain of nothing except her aim. She thought about everything that aim had led her to. "Cecil," she said. "Charlotte," he said. "I would do it again," she said. "All of it, from the shooting line forward." He brought her hand up and held it against the side of his face, the rough, warm familiarity of him as known to her now as the grain of the North Valley soil. "So would I," he said, "every single day of it." Down the hill, Robert's voice rose in some fresh argument with Alina about whose turn it was to throw something for Galileo, and Galileo himself contributed a bark of impartial enthusiasm, and the mountain wind moved through the September grass, and the sky above Plata County was the particular blue that only Colorado produces, deep as water and clear as intention, and Charlotte Bristol Crawford stood in it with her hand in her husband's and felt the full, accurate, earned weight of a life that was entirely, completely, and exactly hers. She had built it from nothing, with her own hands and her father's teaching, and one astonishing rifle shot that had echoed off the mountains on a September afternoon a decade ago and was still, in some important sense, still sounding. She was 36 years old. The debt was paid. The ranch was sound. The children were growing and capable and already developing the specific, particular independence that came from parents who believed in capability above convention. Tomás was resting in whatever peace was available to good men, Compass was buried by the North Valley barn. Goliath, who had given everything expected of him and more, had retired to the lower pasture 2 years ago and moved through his days with the comfortable authority of a patriarch who knew his work was done. Cecil Crawford was standing beside her at the fence, holding her hand, and he was looking at the mountains with the same focused attention he brought to everything. The same attention that had been directed at her, full and complete, for 10 years, and that she expected would continue until they were both old enough for the rocking chairs on the porch that they occasionally mentioned as a theoretical future arrangement, and had never yet gotten around to purchasing. She thought they might purchase them this winter. She thought she would like that. "Come on," she said, releasing his hand after a moment and turning toward the sound of their children and their dog and the ordinary magnificent life that waited for them on the other side of the morning. "We have work to do." Cecil Crawford pushed off the fence rail, settled his hat, and fell into step beside her, and they walked down the hill together toward the Bristol Crawford ranch, toward the cattle and the children and the dog and the endless particular work of the life they had built. And behind them, the September mountains held their great positions against the Colorado sky, and everything that had been uncertain was certain, and everything that had been solitary was shared. And the life that Charlotte Bristol had refused to surrender was the life that she was living, completely and without apology, with the man she had beaten at his own game and thereby permanently won.